The blood had already begun to dry on Timothy Brown's weathered coat when he stumbled through the doorway of the small coastal tavern, his breath coming in ragged gasps that spoke of desperation rather than exertion. In his arms, wrapped in what had once been a white cloth but now bore the russet stains of violence, a baby no more than 6 months old whimpered softly against his chest. The infant's tiny fist clutched at the torn fabric of his shirt, seeking comfort from a man whose hands still trembled with the memory of what he had done to save them both. Sarah Jones looked up from where she stood behind the bar, her cloth pausing mid-wipe across the scarred wooden surface as she took in the sight before her. The stranger's dark hair hung in damp strands across his forehead, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had witnessed too much death in too short a time. Blood streaked his face in patterns that suggested a struggle, and the way he held the child spoke of fierce protection rather than casual care. The tavern fell silent around them, the handful of late-evening patrons turning to stare at this apparition that had emerged from the storm last night. Outside, rain hammered against the windows with the fury of a sea that had claimed too many souls, and the wind howled through the eaves like the voices of the drowned. Sarah felt her heart constrict as she watched the man's legs buckle slightly, his strength finally beginning to fail him after whatever ordeal had brought him to her door. Without hesitation, she moved around the bar, her practical skirts rustling against the rough wooden floor as she approached him. The other patrons watched with the morbid curiosity of those who had lived their entire lives on the edge of the sea and understood that tragedy could wash ashore at any moment. She could smell the salt and copper on him, the mingled sense of ocean spray and spilled blood that told their own story of violence on the waves. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The baby's cries grew stronger as Sarah drew near, and she could see now that the child was unharmed despite the chaos that had clearly surrounded its rescue. Timothy's eyes met hers, and she saw in them a plea that went deeper than mere exhaustion. This was a man who had reached the end of his strength and found himself responsible for a life more precious than his own. 3 days earlier, Timothy Brown had been known by a different name entirely, commanding a crew of 30 men aboard the merchant vessel Prosperity as it cut through the Caribbean waters bound for Port Royal. Captain Timothy Brown, they called him then, though the title sat uneasily on shoulders that had grown accustomed to the weight of compromise. The ship's hold carried legitimate cargo, sugar and rum and fine fabrics, but hidden beneath the false bottom lay the real source of his wealth. Gold stolen from Spanish galleons, silver torn from the hands of merchant crews who had fought too hard to keep what was theirs. He told himself it was business, nothing more. The sea was unforgiving, and a man did what he must to survive. His crew looked to him for leadership, for the promise of coin that would keep their families fed through another harsh winter. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the ship rocked gently on calm seas and the world seemed suspended between night and day, Timothy found himself questioning the path that had brought him to command a vessel that sailed in the gray waters between honest trade and outright piracy. The attack had come without warning, 3 ships bearing the colors of the Spanish Navy emerging from a morning mist that had hidden their approach until it was too late to run. Timothy's crew fought with the desperation of men who knew that capture meant the gallows, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. One by one his men fell to Spanish steel, their blood staining the deck that had been their home for 3 years of profitable voyages. In the chaos of battle, Timothy had found himself in the captain's cabin, searching for the documents that might buy his crew's lives if they were taken alive. Instead, he discovered something that changed everything. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in oiled cloth and surrounded by the personal effects of the ship's previous captain, he found a baby. The child could not have been aboard when they sailed from Kingston, which meant someone had brought it onto the ship in secret, hiding it away from prying eyes and official records. The infant's presence made no sense, not until Timothy found the letter tucked beneath the makeshift cradle. Written in a woman's careful hand, it told the story of Mary Lopez, a merchant's daughter who had fallen in love with a pirate captain and paid the ultimate price for her choice. The Spanish authorities had discovered her affair, and she had been forced to flee with nothing but her newborn child and the hope that her lover would provide sanctuary. But the pirate captain was dead, killed in a raid gone wrong, and Mary had died of fever during the crossing. leaving only her child in a desperate plea for mercy. Timothy stared at the letter as cannon fire thundered overhead, and the screams of dying men filled the air around him. This baby was an orphan twice over, abandoned by fate and circumstance into the hands of men who dealt in violence and greed. The Spanish would show no mercy to a pirate's child, especially not one whose mother had betrayed her own people for love. The infant would be thrown into an orphanage at best, left to die at worst. The decision came to him in an instant that felt like a lifetime. Timothy Brown, the pirate captain, died in that moment, replaced by something he had never thought himself capable of becoming. He wrapped the baby in his own coat, tucking the letter inside his shirt where it would stay dry, and made his way to the stern of the ship. The Spanish were boarding now, their boots thundering across the deck as they secured their prize. But Timothy had found a different kind of treasure entirely. The ship's boat hung from its davits at the stern, small enough to lower quietly into the water while the victors celebrated their conquest. Timothy had used it before to scout unfamiliar harbors, and he knew it could carry him far enough to reach the scattered islands that dotted these waters like stepping stones between freedom and captivity. The baby whimpered as he settled it into the bottom of the boat, but it did not cry, as if it understood somehow that silence meant survival. The next 2 days blurred together in a haze of sun and salt spray, the small boat riding the swells as Timothy fought to keep them both alive. He had managed to grab a water cask and some hardtack before escaping, but it was barely enough for one man, let alone a man and a baby who needed milk he could not provide. The infant grew weaker as the hours passed, its cries becoming more feeble, and Timothy found himself talking to it in the way men talk to God when they have nowhere else to turn. He told the baby about the life he had lived before the sea claimed him, about the farm in Virginia where he had grown up, and the woman he had loved and lost to yellow fever. He spoke of his dreams and his regrets, of the choices that had led him to command a pirate vessel in the moment of grace that had given him a chance at redemption. The child listened with the grave attention of the very young, its dark eyes fixed on his face as if memorizing every word. On the second night, a storm found them. The wind rose from nothing to a howling fury in the space of minutes, and the small boat was tossed like driftwood on waves that towered above them like moving mountains. Timothy fought the tiller with hands that had grown raw and bleeding, trying to keep the boat's bow pointed into the waves while the baby screamed in terror from its nest of wet canvas. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks that turned the world white and black in alternating moments, and thunder rolled across the water like the footsteps of giants. When dawn came, they were alive but barely. The storm had driven them toward a coastline Timothy did not recognize, rocky cliffs giving way to a small harbor where fishing boats bobbed at their moorings like sleeping birds. A town spread up from the water's edge, its buildings weathered by salt and wind, but solid and welcoming in the gray morning light. Timothy's arms ached from holding the baby through the long night, and his throat was raw from shouting encouragement over the storm's fury, but they had survived. The tavern where Sarah Jones worked had once been a ship itself, its timbers salvaged from a merchant vessel that had run aground on the rocks outside the harbor 20 years earlier. The locals had dragged the usable wood ashore and built their gathering place from the bones of the sea's victim, creating a space that felt like the belly of a whale, all curved beams and weathered planks that remembered the roll of waves beneath their feet. Sarah had come to work there after her husband's fishing boat failed to return from what should have been a routine trip to the deeper waters beyond the reef. Alexander Davis had been a good man, steady and kind, who had promised her a life of simple pleasures and quiet contentment. When the sea took him, it left her with nothing but debts and the need to find work that would keep her fed and housed through the long months of winter. The tavern's owner, Benjamin Thompson, was a fair man who understood that widows had few options in a town where the sea provided both livelihood and sorrow in equal measure. He gave Sarah work serving drinks and meals to the fishermen and merchants who passed through, and in return she brought a woman's touch to a place that had been rough and unwelcoming before her arrival. She hung curtains in the windows and kept flowers on the tables, small gestures that softened the hard edges of men's lives. But tonight was different. Tonight, Sarah found herself face to face with a stranger whose presence filled the tavern with an energy she could not name. Timothy Brown stood swaying in her doorway, like a man who had walked through hell to reach sanctuary. And the baby in his arms represented something she had never expected to encounter in this quiet corner of the world. She had always wanted children, had dreamed of filling the small house she shared with Alexander with the sounds of laughter and running feet. But the years had passed without blessing them with a child, and after Alexander's death, Sarah had resigned herself to a life lived for others rather than for the family she would never have. Now, faced with this infant who had somehow survived whatever violence had claimed its protectors, she felt something stir within her that had been dormant for too long. Timothy's eyes met hers across the space between them, and Sarah saw in them a desperation that went beyond physical exhaustion. This was a man who had been changed by whatever he had endured, transformed from whatever he had been into something new and uncertain. The blood on his clothes spoke of violence, but the way he held the baby spoke of tenderness, and Sarah found herself drawn to the contradiction he represented. The other patrons watched with the avid attention of people who understood that they were witnessing something significant, though they could not yet say what it might be. Carl Evans, the blacksmith, set down his mug and leaned forward in his chair, his weathered face creased with concern. Brenda Rogers, the baker's wife, pressed her hand to her throat and whispered a prayer under her breath. They had all seen men return from the sea bearing the marks of tragedy, but never one carrying such precious cargo. Sarah moved without conscious thought, her hands reaching out to steady Timothy as his legs finally gave way beneath him. He was heavier than he looked, solid muscle and bone worn down by exhaustion and whatever ordeal had brought him to her door. She could feel the tremor in his arms as he fought to maintain his grip on the baby, and she understood that he would collapse before he would let go of the child he protected. "Benjamin," she called to the tavern owner, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made a decision without fully understanding its implications. "Clear the back room. This man needs rest, and the baby needs tending." Benjamin Thompson had seen enough of life to recognize crisis when it walked through his door. He nodded once and began herding the curious patrons toward the main room, leaving Sarah alone with the stranger who had brought chaos and possibility into her ordered world. Timothy's breathing was labored, each intake of air seeming to cost him more effort than he could spare, but his eyes remained alert and focused on her face. "The child," he whispered, his voice hoarse from salt spray and shouting. "She needs milk, food. I have nothing left to give her." Sarah felt her heart contract at the raw desperation in his words. She had helped birth enough babies in her time to know that this infant was dangerously thin, its skin pale and drawn in a way that spoke of hunger and neglect. Whatever circumstances had brought them together, the baby's needs were immediate and could not wait for explanations or questions about the blood that stained Timothy's clothes. "Mary," she called to Mary Lopez, the young woman who helped in the kitchen and whose own baby had been born just 3 months earlier. "Bring milk and bring it quickly, and fetch clean cloths and warm water." Mary appeared in the doorway, her own infant balanced on her hip, and took in the scene with the quick understanding of a mother who recognized distress in all its forms. She disappeared back into the kitchen without questions, returning moments later with a cup of warm milk and the supplies Sarah had requested. The efficiency of women who had learned to respond to crisis without hesitation filled the small space with purposeful movement. Timothy allowed Sarah to take the baby from his arms, though she could see the effort it cost him to release his protective hold. The infant was lighter than it should have been, its tiny body fragile in her hands, but its eyes were bright and aware as she cradled it against her chest. She had held many babies in her time, but this one felt different somehow, as if it carried within itself the weight of all the choices that had led to this moment. "What happened?" she asked quietly, settling into a chair and beginning to coax drops of milk between the baby's lips. "Who did this to you?" Timothy's laugh was bitter and short, carrying no humor but a wealth of self-recrimination. "I did it to myself years ago when I chose a path that led nowhere but here. The Spanish found us 3 days out of Port Royal. My ship, my crew, everything I thought I was. It's all gone now." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, heavy with implications that Sarah was only beginning to understand. She had suspected from the moment she saw him that Timothy Brown was not what he appeared to be, but the confirmation brought with it a complexity she had not anticipated. Pirates were the stuff of stories and nightmares in a place like this. Men who existed in the spaces between law and chaos, taking what they wanted and leaving destruction in their wake. But the man who sat before her, cradling his head in hands that shook with exhaustion, did not match the image of a ruthless sea captain that lived in her imagination. There was something broken about him, something that spoke of choices made and regretted, of a man who had found himself responsible for an innocent life and discovered that responsibility had the power to transform him entirely. "The baby," Sarah said carefully, adjusting her hold as the infant began to suckle more eagerly at the milk she offered. "She's not yours." It was not a question, and Timothy did not treat it as one. He lifted his head and met her eyes, and Sarah saw in them a pain that went deeper than physical injury. Her mother was Mary Lopez, a merchant's daughter from Cartagena. She fell in love with a pirate captain named Alexander Nguyen, bore his child, and died for her choice. The Spanish killed Nguyen 6 months ago, and Mary died of fever crossing from the mainland. The baby was hidden aboard my ship, left there by someone who hoped I might show mercy. The story unfolded between them like a map of sorrow, each detail adding weight to the tragedy that had brought them together. Sarah found herself thinking of her own Alexander, of the love they had shared and the dreams that had died with him beneath the waves. She understood something of what Mary Lopez must have felt, the desperate hope that love might be enough to overcome the barriers that society placed between people who dared to choose their own paths. "And did you?" she asked. "Show mercy?" Timothy's smile was sad and tired, but it held something that might have been the beginning of peace. "I'm here, aren't I? I could have left her aboard the ship when the Spanish took it. Could have let them decide her fate. Instead, I'm sitting in a tavern, covered in blood, asking a stranger to help me save a child who has no one else in the world." The baby had finished the milk and was beginning to drowse in Sarah's arms, its tiny fists still clutching at the fabric of her dress as if afraid of being abandoned again. Sarah looked down at the small face, peaceful now in sleep, and felt something shift inside her chest. This child represented everything she had lost when Alexander died, all the possibilities that had been buried with him beneath the waves. But it also represented something new, something she had not dared to hope for in the long months since she had become a widow. The baby needed care, protection, love, all the things Sarah had to give but no one to receive them. And Timothy, for all his past sins and present exhaustion, had proven himself capable of sacrifice in the name of protecting something precious and vulnerable. The sound of horses approaching at speed cut through the quiet of the tavern like a blade through silk. Sarah felt Timothy stiffen beside her, his hand moving instinctively to where a sword might hang at his side, though he carried no weapons now. Through the window she could see torches bobbing in the darkness, their light reflecting off wet stone and the metal of military equipment. "Spanish patrol," Benjamin Thompson said quietly from the doorway, his face grim with understanding. "They've been through twice this week, looking for smugglers and pirates. Someone must have seen your boat come ashore." Timothy rose to his feet with the careful movements of a man whose body had been pushed beyond its limits. But his eyes were clear and focused now. The fog of exhaustion burned away by immediate danger. Sarah clutched the baby closer to her chest, feeling the child's warmth against her heart as the sound of boots on cobblestones grew louder outside. "They'll search everywhere," Timothy said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "If they find the baby, they'll know who I am and what I've done. They'll take her back to the authorities in Cartagena, and she'll disappear into an orphanage or worse." The implications of his words settled over Sarah like a cold wind from the sea. She had heard stories of what happened to the children of pirates and their lovers, how they were treated as symbols of their parents' crimes rather than innocent victims of circumstance. The baby in her arms represented not just a life to be saved, but a future to be protected from the sins of those who had brought her into being. "The cellar," Benjamin said suddenly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had made difficult decisions before. "There's a hidden room behind the wine casks, built during the last war when we needed to hide supplies from raiders. They'll never find it unless they tear the place apart." Sarah felt her heart racing as she looked down at the sleeping infant, then up at Timothy's face. She could see the conflict there, the desire to run warring with the knowledge that he had no strength left for flight. The baby stirred in her arms, making soft sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence of the tavern. "I'll take her," Sarah heard herself saying, the words emerging from some deep place inside her that she had not known existed. "I'll hide with her until they're gone. You stay here, let them see you, but give them no reason to suspect anything more than a shipwrecked sailor seeking shelter." Timothy's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "You don't understand what you're offering. If they find you with her, if they discover what she represents, you'll be marked as a collaborator. They'll destroy your life for helping me." But Sarah was already moving, her decision made with the certainty that comes from recognizing a moment that will define everything that follows. She had spent too many months living in the shadow of loss, accepting that her life would be measured by what she had lost, rather than what she might still gain. The baby in her arms represented a chance at something different, a future that might be built from love rather than sorrow. The cellar beneath the tavern smelled of earth and wine, old wood, and the lingering traces of the sea that had given birth to the building above. Sarah crouched in the hidden space behind the wine casks, the baby pressed against her chest, listening to the sounds of boots on the floor above as the Spanish patrol conducted their search. Every creak of the floorboards, every muffled voice, seemed to echo in the small space like thunder. The baby had begun to whine, sensing perhaps the tension that filled the air around them, and Sarah found herself humming softly under her breath, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her years ago, when the world seemed too large and frightening to navigate alone. The melody seemed to calm the infant, who settled back into sleep with the trust that only the very young can show in the face of uncertainty. Above them, Sarah could hear Timothy's voice, steady and calm, as he answered the patrol captain's questions. He spoke of shipwreck and loss, of a merchant vessel caught in the storm that had battered the coast 3 nights running. His story was simple and believable, the kind of tragedy that happened often enough in these waters to require no special explanation. But Sarah could hear the tension beneath his words, the careful control of a man who knew that one wrong answer, one moment of suspicion, could destroy everything he was trying to protect. She found herself holding her breath during the long pauses between question and answer, her heart beating so loudly she was certain it would give them away. The search seemed to go on forever, boots moving from room to room above her head, furniture being shifted and moved as the soldiers looked for any sign of contraband or fugitives. Sarah heard them in the main room of the tavern, then in the kitchen, then in the small chambers where travelers sometimes stayed the night. Each footstep brought them closer to the cellar entrance, closer to the discovery that would end everything before it had truly begun. When the boots finally descended the wooden steps into the cellar, Sarah pressed herself deeper into the shadows behind the wine casks, one hand covering the baby's mouth to muffle any sound it might make. Through the narrow gap between the barrels, she could see the flickering light of a torch as it moved through the space, illuminating dusty bottles and forgotten stores of grain and salt. The soldier was thorough, she had to give him credit for that. He checked behind every barrel, looked into every corner, even climbed on a crate to examine the ceiling beams for any sign of hidden compartments. But the space where Sarah hid had been built by men who understood the value of invisibility, and it had kept its secrets through 20 years of peace and war. Finally, after what felt like hours but could only have been minutes, the soldier retreated back up the stairs, his boots echoing on the wooden steps as he rejoined his companions above. Sarah remained frozen in place, afraid to move or breathe, until she heard the sound of horses departing and Benjamin's voice calling softly down to her that it was safe to emerge. When Sarah climbed back into the main room of the tavern, she found Timothy sitting at the same table where she had left him, but something fundamental had changed in his posture and expression. The hunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by something steadier and more determined. He looked up as she appeared with the baby in her arms, and she saw in his face a question that went deeper than mere gratitude. "They're gone," Benjamin reported, moving to secure the door and draw the curtains across the windows. "The captain seemed satisfied that you were nothing more than a shipwreck survivor. They'll file their report and move on to the next town, looking for pirates and smugglers who don't exist." But Timothy's attention was focused entirely on Sarah, on the way she held the baby with the natural grace of someone who had been born to motherhood. even if fate had denied her the opportunity until now. The infant was awake again, looking up at Sarah's face with the solemn attention of the very young, and Sarah found herself smiling down at the child with an expression Timothy had never seen on any woman's face before. "You saved us," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of meaning that went far beyond the simple words. "You risked everything for a stranger and a baby who means nothing to you." Sarah looked up from the infant's face, meeting Timothy's eyes across the space between them. "She means everything to me," she said, and the certainty in her voice surprised them both. "I don't know why or how, but from the moment you walked through that door, I knew that she belonged here, with me." The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Timothy had spent 3 days believing that his only goal was to find safety for the baby, to discharge the obligation that had been placed on him by circumstance and Mary Lopez's desperate letter. But looking at Sarah now, seeing the way she cradled the child as if it had been born from her own body, he began to understand that he had found something more valuable than mere sanctuary. "Her name," Sarah said suddenly, looking down at the baby with eyes that had grown bright with unshed tears. "What was her name? Mary must have given her a name." Timothy reached into his shirt and withdrew the letter he had carried through storm and battle, its edges worn soft from handling, but its words still clear. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the careful script until he found what he was looking for. "Esperanza," he read aloud, the Spanish word rolling off his tongue with surprising gentleness. "Hope. Mary named her Hope." Sarah repeated the name softly, testing its sound on her lips, and the baby seemed to respond to the familiar syllables with a small movement of her hands. It was a name that carried the weight of its mother's dreams, the desperate wish that her child might find a better life than the one that had been stolen from her by circumstance and prejudice. The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt both strange and natural, as if the three of them had been meant to find each other despite the violence and chaos that had brought them together. Timothy remained at the tavern, officially as a guest recovering from his shipwreck, but increasingly as something more complex and indefinable. He helped Benjamin with repairs and maintenance, his sailor skills proving useful in a building that had been born from the sea and still responded to its moods and movements. But it was his relationship with Sarah and Esperanza that truly defined these quiet days of healing and discovery. He would sit for hours watching Sarah care for the baby, marveling at the transformation that had come over both of them. Sarah had found a purpose that filled the empty spaces in her life, while Esperanza thrived under the attention and love that had been denied to her during her first months of existence. Timothy found himself changing as well, though the process was more gradual and harder to define. The man who had commanded a pirate vessel through violence and intimidation was learning to find satisfaction in smaller, quieter victories. The successful repair of a broken shutter, the smile that crossed Sarah's face when Esperanza laughed, the peaceful sleep that came at the end of days filled with honest work, rather than the constant vigilance that had defined his life at sea. But the past has a way of refusing to stay buried, and on a morning when the sun painted the harbor gold and the fishing boats prepared for another day's work, Timothy's former life came looking for him. The ship that appeared on the horizon flew no flag, but Timothy recognized its lines immediately. The Retribution had been Alexander Nguyen's vessel before the Spanish killed him, and now it sailed under Nuo command, seeking the man who had escaped when the Prosperity went down. Ashley Murphy, who worked in the tavern's kitchen, was the first to spot the approaching vessel. She called out to Benjamin, pointing toward the harbor mouth where the ship's black hull cut through the morning swells like a blade through silk. Timothy felt his blood turn cold as he recognized the figurehead, a carved woman with her arms outstretched as if embracing the wind, that had once been a symbol of hope but now represented only danger. "Pirates," Benjamin said quietly, joining Timothy at the window. "They'll want supplies, maybe information. Best to give them what they ask for and hope they move on quickly." But Timothy knew it would not be that simple. The crew of the Retribution had sailed with Alexander Nguyen for years, and they would recognize Timothy despite the beard he had grown and the civilian clothes he now wore. More importantly, they would want answers about what had happened to the Prosperity and its cargo. Answers that would lead inevitably to questions about the baby who had been hidden aboard the doomed vessel. Sarah appeared at his side, Esperanza in her arms, and Timothy saw in her eyes the understanding that their brief respite from the world's dangers was coming to an end. The baby gurgled happily, reaching up to grasp at the sunlight streaming through the window, unaware that her very existence represented a threat to the fragile peace they had built together. "They're looking for me," Timothy said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear that had begun to coil in his stomach. "And when they find me, they'll want to know what happened to Alexander Nguyen's child." The confrontation came at sunset when the Retribution's crew had finished resupplying and begun asking the questions Timothy had been dreading. Carl Evans, the blacksmith, had recognized one of the pirates from previous visits and mentioned the stranger who had washed ashore after the recent storm. It was an innocent comment, the kind of casual conversation that happened in every port town, but it was enough to draw the wrong kind of attention. Timothy was in the tavern's back room, helping Sarah prepare Esperanza for sleep, when the door burst open and three men entered with the swagger of those who were accustomed to taking what they wanted. Their leader was a thin man with graying hair and scars that spoke of a lifetime spent in violence. And Timothy recognized him immediately as Olivia Anderson's former first mate, a man called Blackwood, who had served under Alexander Nguyen with unwavering loyalty. "Timothy Brown," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the weight of old grievances and fresh suspicion. "Or should I say, Captain Brown of the Prosperity. We heard your ship went down with all hands, but here you are, alive and well and far from where you should be." Timothy stepped forward, placing himself between the pirates and Sarah, who had instinctively moved to shield Esperanza with her own body. He could feel the weight of the moment, the understanding that everything they had built together hung in the balance of the next few minutes. "My ship is gone," Timothy said calmly. "My crew is dead. I'm no longer the man you're looking for." Blackwood's laugh was harsh and without humor. "That's where you're wrong, Captain. We're not looking for Timothy Brown the pirate. We're looking for Timothy Brown the thief, the man who stole something that belonged to Captain Nguyen before he died." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a cannon blast, and Timothy felt Sarah's sharp intake of breath behind him. He had known this moment would come, had prepared for it during the quiet hours when he watched Sarah care for Esperanza and allowed himself to dream of a different kind of future. But knowing and facing were different things entirely. "I stole nothing," Timothy said, his voice carrying the ring of absolute truth. "Everything I took from that ship, I earned with blood and sacrifice." But Blackwood was not interested in philosophical debates about ownership and obligation. His eyes had found Sarah in the bundle in her arms, and Timothy saw the moment of recognition that changed everything. The pirate's hand moved to the pistol at his belt, and his smile became something cold and predatory. "That's Alexander Nguyen's daughter," Blackwood said, his voice filled with a satisfaction that made Timothy's skin crawl. "Mary Lopez's bastard child, the one that disappeared when the Spanish took Cartagena. You didn't just steal cargo, Captain Brown. You stole Alexander's legacy." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and Timothy saw her stagger slightly as the full implications of Blackwood's claim became clear. Esperanza was not just an orphan child in need of care and protection. She was the daughter of a pirate captain, heir to a legacy of violence and bloodshed that would follow her for the rest of her life unless something was done to break the chain of inheritance. But as Timothy looked at Sarah's face, he saw not fear or rejection, but something stronger and more determined. She had made her choice weeks ago when she first held Esperanza in her arms, and no revelation about the baby's parentage was going to change the love that had grown between them. If anything, the knowledge that Esperanza was truly orphaned, truly in need of the sanctuary Sarah could provide, only strengthened her resolve. "She belongs to no one but herself," Sarah said, her voice carrying a quiet strength that surprised everyone in the room. "And I will die before I let you take her." The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. Timothy fought with the desperation of a man who had found something worth dying for, while Sarah proved that a woman defending her child could be more dangerous than any pirate who had ever sailed the Caribbean. When the smoke cleared and the blood had been spilled, Blackwood and his men lay dead on the tavern floor, and Timothy Brown, the pirate captain, had truly died, replaced by something new and better. In the years that followed, the small coastal town would remember the night when strangers had brought violence to their peaceful harbor. But they would remember even more clearly the family that had emerged from that violence, stronger and more united than before. Timothy Brown became a fisherman and boat builder, his skills with wood and sails serving the community that had given him sanctuary. Sarah Jones became Sarah Brown, and Esperanza grew up knowing herself to be loved and wanted, the daughter of parents who had chosen each other, and her with full knowledge of the costs and consequences. The sea that had brought them together continued to shape their lives, but it no longer held the power to separate them. They had found in each other something stronger than the storms that battered the coast, something more enduring than the ships that came and went with the tides. They had found home, not in a place, but in the love that had grown from the moment a blood-covered stranger had stumbled through a tavern door carrying hope in his arms.